Hello, my name is Michael Dorn-Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. In this video, I will describe a model of communication that would allow proponents of woke psychotherapy, as informed by critical social justice, and its critics, like myself, to engage in constructive, good faith dialogue. In my last video, I called out woke psychotherapy for its use of propaganda in spreading its message. So I thought it would be good for the follow-up video to propose a way forward. And that's what this is about. I'm not so naive as to think that proponents of woke psychotherapy will leap to the opportunity when I propose what I'm going to propose in this video. And in his book, The New Puritan, Andrew Doyle, a British writer and comedian and political commentator, expresses my thoughts on this quite well. And I'm going to read a paragraph from his book. This is on page 285 of The New Puritans. The New Puritans are unable or unwilling to engage in debate without assuming bad faith on the part of their opponents. Many of them consider dialogue to be a tool of the privileged to retain their privilege. Mudslinging is now a standard substitute for rebuttal, and anecdotal evidence is taken as gospel. But for those of us who still believe in the power of persuasion and the capacity of human beings to keep an open mind, there is a moral duty to enter into dialogue with our critics. We do so in order that we might see our own certainties challenged, on the understanding that we are often mistaken. But when our detractors are unable or unwilling to leave aside their prejudices, are convinced of their own infallibility, and perceive any dissent as a signifier of villainy, how is this duty to be undertaken? Under such circumstances, argument is no longer feasible. It's like a boxer adhering to the Queensberry rules only to find that his challenger has brought a machine gun into the ring. Well, I think he said that quite well. It matches my thinking. But nevertheless, I think a workable mode of engagement ought to be proposed, and that, as difficult as it may be, as Doyle says, I also feel it's a moral duty to make the effort. Before describing the particular model of communication that I have here, I want to describe the groundwork, the fundamental foundation that it rests on, and I would call that good faith dialogue. And if there's disagreement, we might call it a debate rather than a dialogue. But nevertheless, I think these ground principles of good faith still need to be present. So I'm just going to read off some of these. The first one is respect. Have respect for each other's perspective and viewpoint. May not agree with it, but respect that the other person has that view and that they have a right to express it. So it starts with respect. Active listening. This means fully listening, not interrupting, not formulating your response while the other person's still talking. It might mean interrupting enough to ask a clarifying question or to repeat back what you've heard to see if you've understood it properly. But really, it involves listening until the other person is completed what they have to say. Empathy. So that we may disagree with a person's point of view, but can we put ourselves in their shoes? Can we get in touch with whatever emotional tone, whatever their emotional experience is? Can we recognize that, appreciate that, and have some resonance with it, even if we disagree with their argument? Open-mindedness. Good faith dialogue, good faith debate means that we consider the possibility that our mind might be changed. That if we're presented with good evidence and a sound reasoning, perhaps we'll change our mind and we'll avoid clinging to our own position at all costs. we're flexible, bringing that open-mindedness. Constructive criticism. When we disagree, when we have a criticism of the other person's point of view, we criticize their argument or challenge their evidence. We don't criticize the person. We don't launch into ad hominem attacks. So, constructive criticism. And it's the idea of trying to find perhaps something valuable in their argument that could be preserved as well. Seek common ground. So there may be a lot of things that we disagree on, but what do we have in common? Are there some shared values, some shared concerns that overlap? Can we look for those in this dialogue or this debate? Can we appreciate them? Can they serve as bridges between us? And finally, generally, civility, which just means not to use offensive language or disrespectful behavior. Basically, it's the way we communicate when we have respect for each other. So these are some basic principles of a good faith dialogue, and they're the foundation or the underpinnings for what I'm going to suggest next. Okay, the model of communication that I'm going to describe in a moment comes from Peter Senge's 1990 book titled The Fifth Discipline. Senge is a graduate of MIT's School of Management and taught at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And I came across this book probably 2002 as I was the executive director for a nonprofit or charity in the States in Northampton, Massachusetts. And the organization I was executive director for is called Windhorse Integrative Mental Health Services. And the particular part, the book generally is about the learning organization, and he separates a learning organization from organizations that aren't learning, and he describes what it is that makes an organization capable of learning rather than simply plodding ahead using the same rules and the same standards and the same methods, but one that adapts and evolves in its environment. And one of the key factors that he describes, I thought it was key, was what he calls the advocacy inquiry approach. And this is a description of how meetings with organizations can go. He has worked a lot with management teams and has done a lot of observing. And he notices that in a lot of organizations, when there's a meeting and ideas are being proposed, advocated for in terms of solving some challenge or some problem, what happens often is that there's a competition of ideas, that people come in and they compete to see whose idea will win in a kind of a back and forth argument, so to speak. And it may seem on the surface that, of course, this seems like a reasonable thing. Get people together and whoever has the best idea will go with that. But he proposes that misses some other opportunities that would make the solutions that come out of those meetings a lot better. For one thing, sometimes the person who's the most aggressive communicator or has the most status or seniority may keep other people silent. They don't want to challenge this person. So he proposes advocacy/inquiry. The advocacy part of it is that people show up. If it's an organization or a business, it's some kind of meeting that people show up. If it's in the context that I'm talking about, it's when any of us show up with others to talk about ideas that pertain to psychotherapy, that there is an opportunity for those with ideas to make their proposals, to advocate their ideas, to propose the evidence that supports them, to give reasoning behind their ideas, and that everybody has a chance to make a robust argument for their position. I'm going to read a little bit here, his guidelines for the process of advocating, putting your ideas out there. Make your own reasoning explicit. How did you come to this conclusion, and what data or evidence is it based on? Encourage others to explore and question your views. For instance, do you see any gaps in my reasoning or any blind spots? Actively inquire into others' views. For instance, what are your views and what are they based on? An invitation and openness to an inquiry into whatever you are advocating. So within his guidelines for advocating, he's insinuating the notion of inquiry even into the process of advocating. When inquiring into another person's, whatever the other person has advocated, what we can do is ask what beliefs or mental models or assumptions underlie it, and what evidence there is for the truth of those assumptions. The key here is to genuinely be curious. It's not to set a person up with questions that make them look silly. It's to really find out what they think in a respectful way. So that's important. He also suggests when we question others' views that we should state our own assumptions about their view, what we think about it, and acknowledge that they're assumptions, that we might be wrong. You state the data your assumption is based on. If there's a reason you've assumed something about the other person's presentation, why? We might be wrong, but there might be evidence that supports it. Senge describes that using this approach can alleviate the tendency to escalate into polarized, rigid positions. Because when one person advocates, the other person simply criticizes with their own view, then the other one entrenches further and amplifies their argument than this one, and you wind up with the clashing titans, right? So this is in order to create a dialogue. And somewhere in the book, he talks about the difference between the word discussion and dialogue. And he draws the connection. Discussion, although it's a rather common word, discussion is related to concussion, right? Things banging together. Dialogue is moving through, penetrating through to another side. So advocacy inquiry is to go beyond discussion and concussion and entrenched, rigid, opposing views and see if there is some kind of common ground. And when we can do that, Senge suggests we access or give rise to collective intelligence. In the other model, what we have is the best intelligence of an individual who dominates and wins the competition in ideas. In collective intelligence, what we get, what can come out of a meeting or a dialogue or a group discussion is an idea or a set of ideas that weren't part of any single person's mind when it started, but it becomes a synthesis and an integration of multiple perspectives and multiple ideas that make sense and transcend any individual's level of thinking. I want to read a paragraph from Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline. This is page 199, I think in this single paragraph he captures the essence of what it's about. Peter Senge says, the most productive learning usually occurs when managers combine skills in advocacy and inquiry. As he's talking to managers, but I think this could apply to any of us. Combine skills in advocacy and inquiry. Another way to say this is reciprocal inquiry. By this, we mean that everyone makes his or her thinking explicit and subject to public examination. This creates an atmosphere of genuine vulnerability. No one is hiding the evidence or reasoning behind his views, advancing them without making them open to scrutiny. For example, when inquiry and advocacy are balanced, I would not only be inquiring into the reasoning behind others' views, but would be stating my views in such a way as to reveal my own assumptions and reasoning and to invite others to inquire into them. I might say, here is my view, and here is how I arrived at it. How does it sound to you? I asked ChatGPT about collective intelligence, and so I got an artificial intelligence response to the question of what collective intelligence is, and it goes like this. The idea that groups, communities, or networks of individuals can collectively generate knowledge, insights, and solutions that are greater in quality and complexity than what could be achieved by any individual or ideologically driven group alone. I think a challenge for those of us who are critical of woke psychotherapy is finding common ground. If we're set on dismissing their ideas, their concerns, their proposed solutions out of hand, then we ourselves are not prepared to engage in a good faith dialogue, and what we say and our demeanor is unlikely to entice them to the table. I believe we have to embody and model the principles of good faith dialogue that we may perceive are missing in them. There's no guarantee that if we make this effort, it'll result in a reasonable conversation, but I believe we have to try. And if what it results in is ad hominem attacks and a refusal to engage, I think that what we need to not do, one is retaliate, and the other is to not make bogus apologies. I think we just need to simply withdraw and call it a day. That's not going to work with this person or this group. But having made the effort to engage, I think is necessary. For me, an assumption that I make that makes my own proposal seem potentially impossible is the assumption that a person devoted to critical social justice theory would make the claim that such an idea is simply an artifact of white supremacy with no other intention but to maintain its power to control and oppress. My evidence for this assumption is several instances I've read where this very thing has been claimed. Nevertheless, I think that my intention, my effort will be to stay open and to not make this assumption in every conversation and wait to see if this is what happens. But if I hear that it's only the lived experience of a so-called marginalized person that has a legitimate claim to truth, I'll know that there's no possibility of a good faith dialogue. It's not that I'm unwilling to listen, even for a long time. But if it's not reciprocal, if the inquiry cannot be reciprocal, I will decide that it's not possible to go further. I will not concede to bullies, and I don't recommend that for anybody. Psychotherapy has evolved over time due to the contribution of countless theorists and practitioners. I'm not advocating a return to some so-called golden age of psychotherapy. It has been and will continue to be that some old ideas under further scrutiny we may decide to abandon. However, I think that we have a rich heritage of understanding and practice that we should preserve, we should respect and preserve and carry forward. At the same time, we're continuing to evolve. More contributions are being made. We should remain open to more contributions. And woke psychotherapy, as informed by critical social justice, has its contribution that it wants to make. And I believe that it should be welcome to the table. And what it has to say should be considered, because we're going to continue to develop with no end. However, I believe that all contributions should be able to bear scrutiny, questioning, inquiry, and criticism, and survive it before their ideas should be embraced and incorporated in the field. If woke psychotherapy is able to do this, that's great. If it's not able to do this, then I think there's no reason any of us should feel compelled to follow their prescriptions or accept their claims. So this video really is an invitation to woke psychotherapy to engage in good faith dialogue. It's also a suggestion to those of us, including myself, who are critical of woke psychotherapy, to make sure we're willing and able to show up for a good faith dialogue. May it happen. Well, that's all for now. If you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, leave me some comments, share this video with somebody that might be interested, and join me for the next video. I'm going to carry on exploring this topic, questioning woke psychotherapy. So long for now. Bye-bye.